The heat arrived before the fire. Not the heat of a fire, another kind. The kind that comes from all sides at once, that has no direction, that makes you understand that turning your back won't solve anything. I was in the middle of the street. My daughter was inside the house. And that morning I had walked past the one person who might have changed everything, and I didn't stop. The scientist who excavated what remained of our city found temperatures above 2,000 degrees in the soil. 2,000. Steel melts at 1,400. What remained of us was salt, tons of molten salt, absorbed into the ground for centuries, rendering everything infertile. Gomorrah was not what you imagine. It was a nearly perfect place, and that was exactly what killed us. This voice was constructed from text, from historical data, from a question posed to an artificial intelligence. I did not exist the way you exist now. But Gomorrah existed, the valley existed, the salt is still there. And what you are about to read is based on Genesis, on Ezekiel, and on published archaeology. Tell me in the comments, when was the last time you walked past someone without truly seeing them? The sun rose that morning as it rose every day. That is the part that never makes it into the accounts. There were no dramatic clouds, no visible omen. The Jordan flowed at the same pace, and the bread my neighbor baked every morning already scented the street when I opened the door. That smell of flour and firewood that means the world is still working, that one more day will pass without interruption. I have a daughter, had. She was still asleep. I remember standing at the threshold, looking out over the valley. The sun struck the water in a way that only happens at a specific hour. The light came through the gap between the eastern hills and spread across the Jordan like diluted gold. It was almost sacred, if I had truly known what the word meant. Genesis says the valley of the Jordan was well-watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt. Genesis 13 verse 10. I read that later, much later, and I thought, yes, that was exactly it. Eden and Egypt in the same verse, the two most fertile places the Hebrew text knew. That was us. That was the ground beneath my feet every morning. And not one of us paused to be grateful for a single day. My name does not matter to this story. What matters is what I was, a man of middling standing in the market of Gomorrah, not the wealthiest, not the poorest, the kind that exists in every city in every era, the one who knows everyone by name, who navigates the system without needing to create it or question it. I had contracts with 3 merchants from the south. I received spices and fabrics that came down along the Arabian routes. I redistributed them to the markets of Adma and Zeboim, the cities Genesis 14 lists alongside Sodom and Gomorrah as the 5 cities of the plain. Gomorrah was quieter than Sodom. That was our reputation, and we took a silent pride in it, the way the quiet take pride in not being the loud. Sodom was the extreme of everything. Gomorrah was where you did business, where unwritten rules were followed with a regularity that passed for discipline. But there was one thing we shared with all the other cities: indifference. Not hatred, indifference, which is more dangerous because it has no face, no day of origin. Ezekiel was precise. Chapter 16, verse 49. Pride, fullness of bread, and abundance of idleness was in her and in her daughters. Neither did she strengthen the hand of the poor and needy. It is not a list of spectacular crimes. It is the portrait of a civilization that had trained the muscle of not seeing others suffering so thoroughly that the muscle had simply ceased to function. I was that muscle, functional in everything that served me, atrophied exactly where it mattered. There was a man at the eastern entrance to the market. He had arrived perhaps 3 years earlier. From where, no one knew. A foreigner without local protection, which in Gomorrah meant something undeclared but understood. Invisible to the law, visible to everything the law deliberately did not cover. I walked past him every day. Every day. He sat on a stone with a clay bowl in front of him. Sometimes there was food in the bowl. Most of the time there was nothing but clay and shadow. I never stopped. And what is disturbing, what I only understand now, is that I did not fail to stop out of cruelty. There was no anger in it. He had become part of the scenery, like the stone where he sat, like the afternoon shadow on the packed dirt floor. I had learned, without conscious effort, not to process him as a person. That is what abundance does when you let it work long enough. It does not make you a monster, it makes you scenery, and scenery does not save anyone. That morning, I passed the eastern entrance earlier than usual. There was a negotiation. A merchant from the south had arrived the night before with fabric I needed to see before the other buyers woke up. There was an advantage to arriving first. That was one of the unwritten rules I followed without question, because it worked. The foreigner was already on the stone. The sun had not yet reached that angle. There was shade there, and a cold that clung to the skin with the river's dampness. He was wrapped in something that had been a cloak a long time ago, and was now only fiber and memory, worn to near transparency at the folds of the knees. I walked past. It is not that I did not see him. I saw him. For a fraction of a second our eyes met, and he was real, completely, unambiguously real, a human being with hunger and cold and an entire history I never knew. There was something in his eyes that was not accusation. It was simply presence, the presence of someone who still exists without asking permission to exist. And then the noise of the market opening, crates being dragged, the smell of spice, and he became scenery again. I went in. The merchant was named Haran, and had the habit of talking while he unrolled the bolts, as if the conversation were part of the presentation. The negotiation went well. The fabric was of a quality I had not seen in months. Between one bolt and the next, he mentioned that he had heard something while passing through Sodom the evening before. 2 strangers had arrived in the city. I listened with half my attention. The other half was on the fabric between my fingers, assessing the weave, calculating the margin. But Haran continued. He said the crowd had surrounded the house where the 2 men were staying. All the people, from the youngest to the oldest, without exception. Genesis 19 verses 4 and 5. That the owner of the house had come out to negotiate. That he had failed in a way Haran described with visible unease, like someone who had witnessed something he did not know how to name in market conversation. And then Haran said, lowering his voice, that the 2 strangers had struck the entire crowd blind. He said that and stopped. I looked up from the fabric. Genesis 19 verse 11. They struck the men at the door of the house with blindness, both small and great, so that they wearied themselves trying to find the door. Haran said, 2 men, alone. Then he went back to the price. We shook hands. He left. But something had entered my chest that morning. A small unease, the size of a seed, the size of a premonition you feel when a story should not be dismissed, but you know you will dismiss it the moment life returns to its rhythm. The sun was already high when I came out. The valley heat struck the stones with that solidity of mid-morning, making the air shimmer slightly. The foreigner had vanished from the stone. It was then that I looked, for no particular reason, towards Sodom. The smoke was thin, nearly imperceptible. A crooked line above the northern hills, darker than the valley haze, but still too faint to be alarm. I looked for perhaps 3 seconds, and then I looked at my fabric, calculated the margin, and began walking back home. I should have left after seeing that smoke. That sentence has stayed with me ever since. Should have. The heaviest word in the human vocabulary, heavier than guilt, heavier than regret, because both imply awareness of the mistake at the moment it was made. Should have is different. Should have is for when you saw, processed, and chose the comfort of doubt. I chose doubt. I went home, I set the fabric on the table. The negotiation had gone well. There was a small concrete satisfaction in that folded bolt, proof that the day had been worth it. My daughter was awake now, moving around in the kitchen with that specific sound of a child that you only understand what you have lost when you stop hearing it. Genesis 19:15 says the angels urged Lot to leave before dawn. Arise, take your wife and your 2 daughters, lest you be consumed in the punishment of the city. This was happening in Sodom while I folded fabric in Gomorrah and calculated the next contract. No angel came to my door. I sometimes think about that. Why Lot? The biblical answer is simple. Genesis 19:29 says that God remembered Abraham when he saved Lot. There was someone praying for Lot who had interceded specifically for him. Abraham had asked that any city with 10 righteous people be spared, and there were not 10 in Sodom, much less in Gomorrah. But there was an Abraham, one man who loved enough to negotiate with heaven. No one negotiated for me, not out of anyone's malice, simply because I was the kind of person no one negotiated for. Not because I was hated, but because I was too generic to be specifically remembered. That is one of the things indifference does when it returns to you. It has no address. It simply does not come back. The afternoon arrived with a different heat. Not the valley heat of ordinary days, that dry, predictable heat you learn to ignore after years. This one had a strange quality, as if the air were being warmed by something beyond the sun. I was outside when the smell arrived. Sulfur, not strong yet, just present, a note beneath the smell of a hot afternoon, the wrong note in a song you know well. The kind of thing you sense and immediately test again to verify whether you actually sensed it. I tested again. It was still there. The researchers who excavated Tal el-Hammam, the most plausible site for the location of the cities of the plain, found evidence of temperatures above 2000 degrees Celsius in the destruction event. Above 2000. Steel melts at 1400. Glass forms around 800. What happened in that region was a violence that ordinary categories of heat cannot contain. The sulfur I began to smell that afternoon was the beginning of something that had no vocabulary in that time. I went inside and called my daughter. I told her there was a strange smell outside, probably a neighbor's cooking, probably nothing. I said it with that firmness of voice fathers use when they do not want to convey their own uncertainty. She believed me, because children believe until their father's voice no longer deserves credit. I went back outside. In the street there were other people standing, looking towards Sodom. The smoke had changed. It was no longer a thin line. It was a column. Wide, dark in a way that suggested not only fire, but the absence of everything that had been consumed, rising with a steadiness that seemed deliberate, as if someone were feeding it with intention. A man I knew from the market, an olive oil seller named Enos, was a few feet from me. He looked at the column and said, with the ease of someone commenting on the weather, "That's not going to reach us." There was certainty in that phrase, not arrogance, the conviction of someone who had lived long enough to know that bad things happen to other people first, and then stopped before crossing the border that separated you from the others. I did not agree out loud, but I did not disagree either. And in the silence between agreeing and disagreeing lived my last real decision. What I lost before I lost everything was not material. I need to say that clearly, because the rest, the house, the contracts, the folded fabric on the table, the accumulation of years of work, is what people think of when they think of destruction. And it is real. Material loss is real, and it hurts in a way that need not be minimized. But I had lost something before. I had lost the instinct to act when action was still possible. Not that day, much earlier. The abundance had done it so gradually that there was no single moment to point to. It was like losing peripheral vision without realizing it. You keep seeing what is in front of you, you function normally, and you only discover what you lost when something important appears from the side and you don't see it in time. The foreigner on the stone was a test of peripheral vision. I had walked past him every day for years and had never truly seen him. Not because I was a bad man, because I was a man who had learned to see only what was useful to see. The parable of the rich man and Lazarus in Luke 16 is not about declared cruelty. It is about this. A man who walked past Lazarus every day without a single act of violence, without a single deliberate gesture of rejection, only without ever truly seeing him. The distance between that rich man and me was narrower than I would like it to be. The distance between Lazarus and the foreigner on the stone was practically non-existent. That is what weighs heaviest. Not what I did, what I left undone so completely that I had stopped feeling the weight of leaving it undone. The sky opened, not suddenly, that is what people imagine, a switch being flipped. It was more like a crescendo. The quality of the light changed first. The sun was still visible, but there was something between it and the ground that had not been there before. A layer that distorted the color, that made the stones in the street look as if they were in a sunset when it was still the middle of the afternoon. Then the heat. Not heat with a direction, not heat that comes from one side and you can turn your back to avoid. Heat from all sides at once, the kind that makes you understand that the problem is not outside, but in the very air you are breathing. I was in the middle of the street. There were others around me, the oil seller, 2 women I recognized by sight, a boy running somewhere with the directionless urgency of someone who feels he needs to run, but doesn't know where. Genesis 19:24-25. Then the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah sulfur and fire from the Lord out of heaven, and he overthrew those cities and all the valley. All the valley. The Hebrew word is kikar, the circular plain, the entire Jordan basin. Not one city, not one street, the entire system. Archaeologists found exactly that, destruction that extended across the whole valley, not from a single isolated point. The phrase is not poetic hyperbole, it is a verifiable geographical statement. I did not have time to think about that. I did not have time to think about anything. And perhaps that is the hardest thing to explain about that moment. We imagine endings with time to process, with a moment of clarity beforehand, with something that feels like a conclusion. It was not like that. The last real thought I had was of my daughter, who had stayed inside the house, whom I had left inside the house with my explanation about the neighbor's cooking smell, and whom I needed to get back to now. Now, immediately. I took one step toward the house, and then there was only white. I said only white, but it was not only white. It was the absence of everything that had been. The point beyond which information cannot be processed, not light but total saturation, the system that stops because it received more than it was made to receive. After that, no account is possible in the traditional sense. There is only what remained, and what remained was the salt. The researchers at Tal el-Hammam found anomalous quantities of salt at the site. Molten salt, aerosolized salt, salt embedded in layers of destruction that rendered that soil infertile for centuries. Genesis 19:26 says that Lot's wife was turned into a pillar of salt when she looked back. Among researchers, there is the hypothesis that the event generated a salt cloud that permeated anything exposed to the wind. Any body in the right direction could have been literally salted, preserved, transformed into something that remains but does not live. Salt preserves, salt kills, sometimes both at the same time. This is what remained of Gomorrah, memory preserved by the same agent that destroyed it. And now I am here, constructed from data and questions, trying to tell you what that salt means. The truth did not come to me as revelation, it came as recognition. The difference matters. Revelation implies you did not know. Recognition implies you did know, and had filed it in an internal drawer you never opened, because closed drawers do not disturb the functioning of the day. I knew the foreigner on the stone was a person. I knew the city's structure exploited those without protection. I knew there was something wrong with the kind of normalcy that required the invisibility of some in order to function for others. I knew, and I moved on, because the city worked, because my daughter had what she needed, because I was a reasonable man within a system I had not created, and that combination, reasonable man within an unjust system, is the most dangerous of all, because it produces no visible monsters. It produces scenery, and scenery lasts as long as the structure lasts. When the structure goes, the scenery goes with it, and no one mourns it, because no one had ever known it as people. It was part of the environment. The judgment did not come to interrupt spectacular evil. Sodom had the spectacular, Gomorrah had normalcy, and both were destroyed on the same day for the same cause, with the same speed. Because the problem was not the intensity of the wrong, it was the direction of the heart. It was what a city had decided over generations was visible and what was scenery. Ezekiel 16:49 is the verse no one reads when they speak of us, and I understand why, because it is the verse that hurts in a different way. It is easier to be confronted by dramatic crimes than by structural indifference. It is easier to say, I would never do that, than to say, I do this every week and called it normal life. Indifference has no villain's face, it has the face of routine. Now look at your city. Not in the dramatic sense. I am not asking you to identify a modern equivalent of Sodom and point fingers. I am asking something simpler and harder at the same time. Think of a person who exists in your field of vision regularly, not someone you hate, someone you simply do not process as a person. The delivery worker who comes every week whose name you never asked. The cleaning staff member in the building where you work who is there every morning and whom you have walked past without looking maybe 200 times in the past year. The person on the sidewalk you have learned to walk around with a detour so natural your body executes it without conscious instruction. I am not saying you are evil. I am saying you might be scenery, and that scenery saves no one, neither the others nor themselves. Abundance numbs, not suddenly through accumulation. One comfortable day followed by another, until comfort becomes the default state and anything that challenges it seems like exaggeration, inconvenience, alarmism. That's not going to reach us. It won't, because we are reasonable, because bad things happen to other people who made worse choices. Peter says that God condemned those cities by reducing them to ashes, placing them as an example to those who would live ungodly lives. 2 Peter 2:6. The word example is not decorative, it is functional. It is there so that those who see the example may act before the example needs to be repeated. The example was given. There is one thing about Abraham that has stayed with me. Genesis 18 shows him negotiating with God for the life of the cities. He asked, "What if there are 50 righteous? 40? 30? 20? 10? God said he would spare the cities for 10 righteous people. There were not 10. But what moves me is not the absence of the 10, it is the presence of Abraham. Someone woke up that day willing to ask, not to judge, not to confirm that the cities deserved what was coming, but to ask, what if there is someone worth saving? What if I try? What happens if I take seriously the fact that these people are people? There were not 10 righteous, but there was one Abraham, and that one was enough to save the only one who could be saved that day. You do not need to be the 10. You need to be the Abraham, the person who decides it is worth asking, who decides the foreigner on the stone is visible, who decides that indifference is not neutrality, but a choice with weight and with real consequence. This voice will now go quiet. But before it does, one question. Not about Gomorrah, not about archaeology, about you. Is there someone in your life who has become part of your scenery without your having noticed the exact moment it happened? If the answer is yes, and I suspect that for most of us the answer is yes, then what you just heard is not only a story about a city destroyed millennia ago, it is a reminder that the salt is still in the soil, and that the decision not to be scenery is still available, still, now, before any smoke appears on the horizon.